First of all, I want to thank the chairman of the Financial Services Committee, and that would be the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Jeff Henseling, for his leadership in helping to bring a number of bills, as we've just seen, to the floor today. I would also like to thank all of my colleagues on the Financial Services Committee from both sides of the aisle, obviously both sides, because they have voted unanimously, voted for the Disclosure, Modernization, and Simplification Act out of committee, not just once, but twice when you conclude information or passage of last year as well. I would also like to add this legislation passed the House of Representatives by voice vote in December of 2014. So you ask, what is the purpose of this bill and why is it necessary? Well, Mr. Speaker, look, if you step back about 8 decades ago, Congress made the monumental decision in this country that disclosure, opening up and transparency would be the centerpiece of our nation's securities law. See, instead of carving out or creating a merit review system where the federal government determined which companies were allowed to put our money into, Congress wisely went down the other road and decided that those decisions would be best made where? Left in the hands of the people, in the hands of the investors themselves, so long as they were provided with a sufficient level of disclosure from publicly traded companies. Unfortunately, over the last 8 decades since the security laws were first put in place, the quarterly and annual reports filed by the public companies have grown, and they've grown in size tremendously, larger and more complex than ever, to the point now where the most sophisticated of investors have trouble understanding even the most basic operations and risks of these companies. This has become to be known as a phenomenon of information overload. So to put this in perspective, a recent article in the Wall Street Journal noted that the average annual report from public companies is now 42,000 words, a 40% increase just from the year 2000 alone, and even longer than the entire Sarbanes-Oxley bill that passed Congress in 2002. And another recent report out of Stanford University found that only 38% of institutional investors view disclosures about executive compensation as, quote, easy to understand. So if you think about it, if the majority of institutional investors can't understand the disclosure, what chance does the little guy have? The mom and pop investor have to understand all this. They, of course, have very little chance and can even be harmed by the disclosure that too voluminous and complex reports show. And then the SEC Commissioner, Troy Parity, has put it this way back in 2013. He said, quote, if investors are overloaded, more disclosure actually can result in less transparency and more decisions and worse decisions, in which case capital is allocated less efficiently and market discipline is compromised, end quote. So what would our bill do today? It would rectify the situation. How? 1, it would require the SEC eliminate any outdated or duplicative disclosure requirements that are not material to investors, and to furthermore to scale disclosures for emerging growth companies and small issuers. 2, it would allow issuers to file a summary page of their annual report that would include simply cross-references to the material already included. And 3, it would require the SEC to produce a broad study on how best to, among all the other things like utilize technology in order to improve delivery and presentation systems for disclosure, and also a requirement that the SEC commence a rulemaking in order to implement some of these ideas that come out of the study. You see, these provisions will help our disclosure regime of the 21st century, while at the very same time address the issue of information overload that I mentioned before. See, if you go back, as part of the Jobs Act, Congress directed the SEC to review its existing disclosure requirements, and it was told to identify ways to make our current disclosure regime less burdensome for issuers and for people as investors. While the SEC produced a report a few years ago, 2013, that identified a number of obsolete things and duplicative requirements that could be addressed, unfortunately, the agency has yet to act upon them, despite an ongoing disclosure effectiveness review that has so far only produced a concept release. So at the end, it is important that this Congress come here today and act upon and on the behalf of all the American investors, all the people in this country, in order to keep the original intent of our securities laws relevant today and ensure that the effective disclosure remains this very centerpiece of the capital markets. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the